Are you a boomer, a millennial, Gen X, a zoomer? Do you really not know which? Are you born in a particular year that for some reason you get told by one people that you're this year and then another people you're this year? Welcome everyone to Geopolitics Tyberius D, and today we're going to be looking at demographics and particularly generations and how those break down and tell us how people are behaving in a modern society. Welcome back, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about generations. Now, generations is a really weird kind of thing, at least for me, in the regards that I don't necessarily talk about generations as a demographic subset. Demography is incredibly important to me and what I do. And we basically talk about how people age out regarding, are they children? Are they young adults? Are they older adults? Are they retirees? We talk about people in their ages, but we don't talk about them as a subgroup of people that goes up through the ages. That's not necessarily something that I used to be able to do, or, most likely didn't really involve myself with. But in a general nutshell with this slide is that this is how I kind of see the world in regards of, do we have as many younger people as we have older people? Do we have more people in their 30s and their 20s, or 40s and their 50s? These are really important economics, and we're going to talk about that in my next video. But I do want to talk about the generations, and there's a lot of confusion with it. So let's get into that. First is, what are you, right? Are you a boomer? Well, there's a lot of different years for what have been boomers. Do you start in 1941? Do you end in 1960? It tends more towards 65, but some people, kind of throw that up in the air. We're not quite sure. Gen X, I actually call you guys the shadow generation. I know you all never got one of those cool, sick, evil nicknames, but yeah, take mine. You guys are the shadow generation because you were just basically overshadowed by everybody to a large degree. Pretty much everyone actually agrees that this ends in 1980, but does it start in 61 or 66? Big deal there as well. Millennials are still pretty much up in the air to some degree. Pretty much agreed that it starts in 81, but no one really agrees if it ends in 95, 2000, or 2005. And then Gen Z, the big Zoomers, well, you can tell there that there's a lot of questions to be answered when it comes to them. So we're going to explain why that is. First things first. We're going to start with generational theory. This comes out of the early 90s, but through the 90s in general, mainly by these two guys. On the left is William Strauss. He left us back in 2007, but his work was very consequential to this field. On the right is Neil Howe. What the hell's wrong with me? Neil Howe is basically kind of the pro-pioneer. He was, I believe he was an understudy to Strauss, but he's still kicking, still around, and has been talking a lot more in the news the last couple of years on how he kind of called it, and we'll get into their particular theories as to how a lot of things that are unraveling are basically what these guys said. There's 4 major books, but I wanted to hit the big 2. The first one was Generations, that really kind of paved the way for all of this in the regards that they showed, and we'll visualize their work here in just a minute, but they largely show that each couple of years you would have a set of a generation, a group of people who had like a common heritage and a common history that was like a subset of the greater American culture, and they even say it up on here: a proactive, critical and engaging analysis of the rhythms of American life. And then, of course, in 1997, you have their other big thing, the fourth turning. So let's talk about what their major work is and why it's important to you guys. These are a lot of diagrams, and I'm sorry, but their work does get really, really complicated. So let's make this very quick. We'll take a look at the thing on the right here, and I'll break that down. They believe that the world is composed, or not the world, I'm sorry. They believe that generations are composed of what they call the 4 turnings, right? This is the high period, the awakening period, the unraveling, and the crisis. And the basic thing that you want to go here is like the meme of good times make weak men make bad times. That whole, mantra, literally what they said. And they basically put it into this, and you can see it. We're going to start in 1908 to 1929. you have the youth, the GI generation. They are a heroic generation overall, and so they'll be protected when they're young. When they're adults or young adults, they'll be heroic. They'll be powerful in their midlife, and they'll be civic virtuous elders as they age. And then it goes on. Silent generation, the boomers, Generation X, millennial. Okay, so basically, you kind of can get your sense of when you're born, of what role you're supposed to play whenever you get to a certain age group. So if you're the guys that are supposed to tear everything apart, you're indulged, and then you become visionary and moralistic, and you turn into the modern boomers, people who claim to be wise and try to be wise, but really aren't. They are always the antithesis of the two generations before them, being the GI generation. And that the GI generation are basically the people who go through hell, who understand what matters, what works, what doesn't, and builds out a society that basically works. And so you have this high on period that comes into the first turning, to where these people take charge and they start running everything, and they become the great generation of their era, and they build everything out. The kids largely, or if you will, the following generation, because that sometimes doesn't overlap, those folks will kind of just live in the prosperity and the power of that society, but they won't really make much murmurs. They're overshadowed by their predecessors. What's weird about this particular rhythm is how big the boomers were. The boomers, or the third turning, it's always that generation that's going to challenge the status quo, because it always seems a little too restrictive. These are always a little bit more independent thought people. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, the problem that we keep seeing in this cycle is that, whether you believe it or not, this cycle basically shows that this is the generation that kind of unravels things to a point where everything starts breaking down. Now, if you want to look at this on the positive side, I would say that everything kind of needs a good shakeup every now and again, because sooner or later, just positions of power and institutions of ability break down. They get decadent. They basically fall apart from the inside, from the fact that they just don't reform. They don't change. The institutions aren't supposed to change. They need overhauls every now and again, basically. And so you get the fourth turning, you get the crisis generation, which they're not the cause of everything going to hell, but they will live through it. They're the ones that are just like, oh crap, the end is nigh. And so while this is kind of ridiculous to some of you, what this will basically means is that you have every 4 generations an overall cycle where you'll have a horrible time that leads into some better times, because people have to survive. People have to figure out what works and what doesn't. And that's basically the kind of the big riff here. So, reasons to believe this. If you look through their history and what they've laid out, you can pick out a few minor details here, but moreover, when you've seen that the real big trends they've hit were true. 80 years before World War II, as an example, in this cycle, you have the American Civil War, right? This is basically every 80 years in this country, everything goes to crap. And then if you move forward 40 years in between, you usually have the Americans at their high, even if they're having a little bit of a problem. So as an example, you get like the 60s all the way up into the 80s. But that is their theory in a nutshell. Any reason to believe that this is not right? Well, according to this cycle, the millennials are supposed to be our next saviors. And while I would absolutely love that, being a millennial, I'll tell you what, guys, we are way more echo boomer than we are echo great generation. So we're going to have to figure that one out. But we'll talk about that towards the end. Visualizing their work further is that this is basically, in general, what they thought. They figured that a generation was every 22 years, give or take, on average. Sometimes it would be 20, sometimes it would be more towards 25. But they didn't do this by any particular data. They did this by, like, cultural narrative, the talking points, what the newspaper said, what was going on in the world itself. And so, if you look at this graph, you kind of see where the generations kind of go together, but you also see where they kind of don't, right? And it's not necessarily that this is a bad worldview at all, but what I do kind of want to generally overall give you is that I think they're right on the general cycle, but they're not really so much right when it comes to the generational breakdown, and we'll get that here in a second. But long story short, great generation born before 1920. Born between 1921 and 40 is that you have the silent generation, or I'm sorry, you have the silent generation. 41 to 60 is the boomers. 61 to 80 is Gen X. 81 to 2000 is millennial, and 2001 to probably about 2020 would have been what they called the Homeland generation. We now call them Gen Z. You'll notice that some of those numbers may not line up with what you have heard. Some people put the 61 to 65 within the boomer category, and some people put 1996 to 2000 in the Zoomer category, or 2001 to 2005 in the millennial category. That's largely kind of died off now, to be honest. But let's talk about the guy who pretty much broke all this down and kind of changed the conversation and where we're probably going. Enter that out of that. Okay, so this guy is Jonathan Haidt, and he made a number of books. He's actually weird because this was not what he was setting out to do, if you kind of put it in here. He's a moral, like, sociologist, if you want to put it in that way. He looks at what people care about and what their moral understandings are and what their moral predations are. Overall and in general, though, is that he mapped out by the data where these generations change. Because we could see by the way they behaved and certain behavioral patterns that is codified in data, such as when are they the first time they get left home alone, when they get their first house, when they get their first car, when they get their first, or when they get their driver's license, all these things. This guy showed by the data where generations were splitting apart, and it wasn't really where our good friends Strauss and Howe were at. And so, as a whole, you'll notice that this looks a lot nicer when it comes to generations as far as population trend. And the long story short for me that I can give you guys is that Haidt has really kind of shown that by cultural narrative, they are kind of right that there's an 80-year cycle, but it's weird in that basically you either get a super generation that kind of coalesces two of these subgroups into one, or you get a complete schism to where you have basically a generation that is very similar to another, but they do not agree on anything. And so the last time this kind of went around, you have the Great Generation, which according to Haidt's data actually starts in 1905, but goes to 35. It was a 30-year generation, but it was comprised of people who start off maybe seeing World War I, but no matter where you were born in this particular era, is that you see trials and tribulations, whether it's you literally have, you have World War I, you have the Roaring '20s, which while is great for some people, actually wasn't great for everybody, but that's the best part of this whole era. You have the Great Depression, the Dust Bowls, you have workers' rights issues, that kind of thing, leading all the way up into, of course, World War II. And then after World War II, a lot of people don't realize that this era still doesn't end. You have a massive recession going up all the way into 48 that is still keeping people from getting off or getting back on their feet. And so overall, as soon as that kind of gets going and we get the American economy moving, Korea breaks out. And so basically from either from 1914 or, if you will, 1917 to 1955, we're in this constant state where everything's kind of going to hell, and you have this super generation consolidate to fix everything. Silent generations just kind of largely overshadowed by their predecessors and their children or their followers, and so they're named Silent Generation. The boomers are what they are. Now, of course, if you look at this data on this graph, the boomers don't look nearly as big as some other generations, and that's simply because they're dying. Once you get about to the age of 60, mortality shoots through the roof, and many of you who may be boomers watching this will know that y'all are probably seeing a number of your friends die. Well, that's more my particular subject matter that we'll talk about in the next video about how people are when they are certain ages. But as a whole pejorative, the boomers are a huge generation that you can see there right now that are just kind of coming out of their prime, or if you will, the workforce. They're kind of coming out of the whole system at large, and that is having tremendous implications throughout American society so far. You have the shadow generation, aka Gen X, which is basically overshadowed by their forebears, the boomers, and their subbearers, the millennials. Bigger generations completely outpace them. Basically, the long and the short here for me is that Gen X will never really get a good day, and that kind of sucks. Millennials, of course, are a massive generation. They're supposed to be the boomers' kids. There's some weird numbers in that one because if you're talking about these generations that are 15 years going, the average boomer and their kid was 22 years apart. So it makes sense to be most of the millennials, but not all. And of course, you'll have a few Gen X parents in there as well. You can see it going in, Zoomers down toward the bottom, and then Alpha generation creeping up there in the last 10 years. But let's talk about who they are. Now, this is my own interpretations to some degree because, quite honestly, no one can really agree on when these generations technically start yet. I'm thinking hate's going to win out overall when this conversation's pretty much over. But overall, at least I want to put it down to, is that if you don't agree on where the lines are, you're not going to have a real conversation. So giving you the lines that I gave with hate where, you are a great generation from 1905 to 1935 and so on with that graph, is that this is who I'm describing. The Great Generation, if you guys had the pleasure of ever meeting them, they were very down-to-earth people. They knew what mattered. And if you actually can talk to anyone who is still alive from that time, they still are like that. They won't talk about stuff that's really all that nonsensy. Now, a lot of people sometimes like to argue, it's like, well, they're just old. Most of them are 90 now. But if you met any of them, even going back, years and years and years ago, even before my time, they always have kind of been like that. Most people have always talked about how they were, at least to me, far more down to earth and I'll put it this: they're very task-oriented people. They're like, hey, look, what really matters to me? It's like, oh, you're talking about this? Don't care. And they also had a very big growth mindset. Although the big thing that I can say that I didn't care about that generation is they were hoarders. They were afraid that anything that you didn't have, you would never have ever again. And I assume that was largely due to the rationing and the Great Depression. But they were definitely people that didn't want to get rid of anything if they had it, because they knew that if they needed it, they might not be able to get it. The silent generation was largely overshadowed in the same way that the Gen X would be at some point, and that's really unfortunate. But they do kind of echo each other to some degree. That is quite sad. But I'll put it this way: most of the silent generation broke one of two ways. The early silent generation actually acted like an extension of the Great Generation, while the older part of the silent generation ended up acting like older or super boomers. And this is where we get our Joe Bidens from. Getting onto those boomers, you might see something there, maybe a little bit inflammatory. But I'm going to come out swinging with it now. The boomers were cancer. Whether you look at it one way or another, is that if you have a problem with the way the world works, and particularly the modern world works, blame them, because it's just generally they're the ones who did it. So number one, record debts and divorce. If you actually go down the numbers of what we find socially destructive, the boomers per capita and per age have set records on every category into being socially destructive. If you're talking about household debt, corporate debt, government debt, running up deficits, putting things on the credit card, this generation almost literally can't do math. That has been a massive problem overall, and that will die with them, unfortunately. When it comes down to some of the other social ills, whether you're talking about divorce, whether you're talking about health, longevity, obesity, all these things. Again, this is a generation that set records for doing all the wrong things. For a generation that thinks that they've got it down right, they really never did. And going into that second part is that they really had a tunnel vision when it comes to the way that they saw the world. Basically, being the size that they were, they had this weird thing when they came up to in their age group, is which they were so huge and so prominent that even though they had to hyper-compete amongst themselves, them as a generation completely overshadowed everybody, particularly their parents. And so when you see this voter group enter adulthood into the late 70s and early 80s, you see an entire political revolution under this guy named Reagan. That was not the Great Generation's last gasp, as much as people like to make it. This is the boomers coming into their own voice, and this is where everything really goes to hell. Even if you think or look at some of these numbers where younger people tended to vote Democrat. That was definitely not nearly the case back in 1980. And we see that today with a lot of these policies that were instituted during this time actually came back to bite us in a big way. I'm very critical of certain groups of people politically and how they behave. And while the Democrats have actually screwed up in a lot of different ways, this is a right-wing fault. The Republicans in this generation openly abandoned civic duty and virtue, which is literally the antithesis of what their grandparents or their parents were under the Great Generation. This is the generation that said, man, this generation's a bunch of squares. This is the generation that switched from cocaine to Rogaine. Long story short, at least for me, is that they never could answer up to their predecessors, but they never got that competent reality check of, hey, you guys really suck, because no one's had to force it on them. Basically, in a nutshell, they literally got rid of the draft right before this generation came of age, or as this generation's coming of age. The Soviet Union breaks down during the time that they could, be drafted into a massive war. And of course, we also had like nuclear weapons and stuff, so if war came, it was going to be the end. The long and the short here is that this generation really never had to pay for anything. And you can see that with the way that they invest and the way that they actually grow anything. Is that overall and in general, they like to spend money on the credit card and then just pass it along forever and ever and ever. This is the most indebted generation per capita in American history, by far. So, while they may have 80% of the wealth in the country, they also have 80% of the debts. Moving on forward, is that they became really jaded. And I don't think it's really a guess to figure out why. They don't know how the world works, and they've really been showing it the last couple of years. They wonder why their kids can't figure out which is the right bathroom to use, as they like to put it, or why they're a bunch of communists and whatnot. Well, it's because you abandon education, you abandon civic duty, and you abandon civic structures, and this is the price you pay for doing that. And so my rant against the boomers is over, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed that one very much as we go on to Gen X, or the Shadow Generation. I love Gen X. I really do. They have two big things about them. One is both a good and a bad, and the other one's kind of a bad, and I'll put it in this regard. They tend to be what we call one-trick ponies, and this is, I should have put that in quotations, but long and short here is that they tend to be really good at 1, 2, or 3 things. Which, I mean, I guess you could say that's most people, but I want to make it very specific. They're very, very much the kind of people that were really good at doing one thing. They said they could be hyper competitive with it. That's not only how they competed against each other, that's how they competed against the boomers who were drowning out the labor market. So when you meet Gen X, they usually are the most competent people in the workforce that you can possibly find. They make the boomers look bad. On the other side of that, though, is that if you get them out of whatever their little niche is, they tend to fall apart completely. This is a generation that is really big on having to call in other people to help, even though people claim they're antisocial, they really aren't. This is the last generation that we see still in the technical trades field, where if you're plumbers, electricians, whatever, Gen X is actually doing pretty well. A lot of people talk about how that's a boomer thing. Gen X per capita really does knock it out of the park on this one. They're not nearly as bad as the next people coming up. Before we get there, a bit of a personal criticism, and I think they all know this. They were always personally inner focused, trying to be the best that they could be, so they could be good providers or competitive in the workplace. But they bottle up a lot of stuff inside, and you guys will definitely notice as they've interacted with the millennials, they actually been kind of breaking down a little bit more. Where the millennials are like, hey, you can share how you feel. That's okay. And Gen X has actually kind of had this. I'm not gonna call it a moral awakening, but they've had a I don't know, like an enlightenment of some sorts, where they've been able to engage with their peers in ways that haven't been seen before. While millennials grew up in the era of the tech revolution, Gen X is actually remarkably accommodated to all of these new savvy tech trends. And I would say, if you want to look at where the cultural narratives are, while the millennials are definitely creeping their things in there with Super Saiyans and, the Asian invasion in the 1990s, is that a lot of the overall trends within the modern subset of America is probably a Gen X thing. You can definitely see that if you're talking about Thor Ragnarok or Guardians of the Galaxy as an example. They're very much like 80s rock house operas, a really kind of cool thing. But moving on to the millennials. we had so much hope. We really did, but it's not good, guys. We're probably the boomers 2.0. It's that we are not showing an iota of competency. And you know what? I will say it. We can blame the people who raised us to some degree, but we all know what's going on isn't working, and we are failing to change in a particular way. And it's weird. It's not that we're not changing personally. The average millennial has probably had more careers than anybody else has even tried or thought of. But it's not something that we're grounding ourselves in. We keep bouncing from thing to thing to thing, and I included in this. We've not been able to make things work for us in the way that our parents and our grandparents were able to. And there's a level of absolute apathy and disdain for the systems that be from the millennials. But we haven't galvanized it at all. So I want to end with a good note here that I want to add on to, because the boomers, we're getting old, but millennials, we're getting old, but we still have a chance not to be the boomers. Sorry, Freudian slip, right? What it comes down to it is that we're getting older, but we're not too old yet. We can still change. And the thing that this generation is going to have to do to make this all work out, if at all, is one, recognize that we're in the shit. There is no success without us. So if you've got this idea of waiting for somebody else or Gen X to come fix it or whatever else, there isn't. Because we, as a generation, and this is the only reason I actually probably did this whole presentation, is that millennials are a generation that is socially active and tech savvy and actually educated enough that, if we're not complete brain dead, we've got the tools to fix this. We just need to figure out what we're going to do. And so I'm going to preach to my fellow millennials just for a second here. Number one, we got to recognize we're in the shit. There is no easy way out. We're going to go through pain. It's going to be suffering. It's going to be bad. The question is that, do we have a mentality of growth, or do we have a mentality of maintaining? Because I'm going to say it right now, the boomers were the maintainers, and you can't maintain what is broken. Sometimes you have to rebuild, you have to grow, and you have to fix. So I think whatever our forebears are saying, let's just ignore them for a while. Let's figure out what works for us and start building upon those bricks, because we don't really have a choice at this point, because they're just wrong, right? The next part that I want to get into is obviously the Zoomers. The Zoomers are weird because they're young enough to really change, but they're different than from the millennials in one key aspect. They're a lot more antisocial. And you can say whether this is a consequence of growing up with modern media, and particularly with modern social media, to where, you know what, after a while, and particularly once you get out of high school, you see that bullying, you see that interactions that you have with people that are incredibly toxic. And by the way, if anyone doesn't understand, Zoomers, think about all the bullying that you got in high school, whether you're millennial, Gen X, what have you, and now imagine it comes home with you. Because that's what social media did, is allowed bullying and toxic behavior that you experience in high school, and you're dealing with it every minute of every day because your phone is fucking wired into the shit. And so, in a long story short, once the Zoomers are actually leaving high school, they become radically antisocial in the regards that they don't want to interact with people because they're jaded as shit, because they weren't treated right. The good news is that you guys have the ability to change, but you've got a hang up. You've got millennial morals, the things that we we're being told, we need to do right. The same thing that Gen X was told, y'all were told too, and everybody, I'm telling you, they were wrong. You're going to have to figure this out. The question is, can we do what the great generation did, kind of pull our forces together here and figure out what's going to work for both of our generations? Or are we going to have a subdivision split to where millennials go one way and Zoomers go the other, and we just trying to figure out what works that way? Usually the last time that generations kind of did that, we got really close to the Civil War, and may have been one of the causes of that, but it's a whole other issue. Anyway, I've been rambling on for 30 minutes. I hope you guys really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for coming, and thank you for watching. On the next presentation that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be talking about my end of this particular field, and that is demography. Basically, what is it that young people contribute to the society? What do children contribute? What do the elders contribute? What do the retirees contribute? Or decontribute, actually. That's a big thing. So I'll be talking about all that in a nutshell, kind of unpacked and unexploded. And I'll talk about, actually, how demography is pretty much bringing the end of normal. We're going to be talking about labor relations in particular here in the United States, and we're going to be looking at the greater world, and we're going to be talking about how pretty much we're not going to get to a world of 10 billion people. We're going to get to a world of 1 billion people because the world stopped having kids. And so without further ado on that one, inflation will be after that. We'll be talking a little bit about how supply and demand works and how inflation is not quite what everyone understands it to be. They got about half the picture right, but they don't have the other half, and that's really important. We'll also be doing immigration, Latin America, and the generating of wealth. That one actually will be a revisit from a prior book discussion that we were doing. But without further ado, my name is Tyberius D. I hope you all have a great time doing what you're doing. We'll be having an open Q&A here on the Twitch if you'll be joining us, and we might actually record that one. We'll have to see. But I do thank each and every one of you for watching, for listening, and being involved with this wonderful presentation. Excuse me, we're going to be talking a little bit about the questions from chat. And so I definitely want to hit one in particular. David Johnson at Tiberius D. What do you think millennials and Zoomers have to do to turn this around? I kind of outlined that a little bit during the discussion, but I want to make this very, very clear while I have the chance, is that I think the normal status quo on most of everything is a little bit broken, right? And that goes from education to healthcare to whatever, is that we kind of have to realize that we're going to have to be a little bit radical and reformy. And I don't want to hit that in the regards that, oh yeah, revolutionary communism, let's go fascism or anything like that. No, that's psycho. But we do have to realize that we need new ideas for the 21st century, because if you look at if you're looking at education overall, most of the overhauls that were done to that were done in the 1960s and the 1980s, and none of that has really been updated since. We can talk about how, certain generations write the curriculum and all that, but I'll put it this way. There are things that we can learn from our elders, even the wretched boomers, but the long and the short, at least for me, and what I need to very much codify for everybody, is that we need to work with people, whether it be ourselves, our children, and our parents, to get where we need to be. And that is, I think millennials need to grow a pair. And what I mean by that is we need to openly be like, look, if you're a boomer, that's great. You literally are throwing us the bad slip, and we're going to have to hold you to the rocks for this. So, I'm not going to say you have to take away their Social Security, although if we actually showed that we were competent, that's what we would do. Is that, all right, cool, we will give you your retirement even though you fucking don't deserve it. What we need to do is you guys are going to be running stuff and making sure things are done, because, look, you guys are halfway to retirement or almost at retirement or are retired, and the reality is that we don't have time to make sure that everything's working right because we're doing the bottom-end jobs or the middle-end jobs, and you guys aren't doing, or I'm sorry, what is working before isn't working for us. We're not dealing with that shit no more. So you're going to make it work for everybody because you guys, are in charge, or at least in the positions of power. You have to do that overall. So basically what this means is that if you have a parent that is retired or near retirement, you tell them, you run for school board, you run for, public office, you run for this, and you say, hey, look, this is what we all believe in. This is what we need to have done, all right? Because you haven't been in school for 30 years, but my kid's in school, so let me tell you what you need to have fixed. You go fucking fix it for us because we're family. We need to get this stuff done. And so you kind of pressure the issue, because I'm going to be honest, I'll put it this way. Millennials need to stop being bullies about a joke that you see on social media, which is clearly a joke, and about the reality that we got screwed and no one cares because we haven't forced the issue. Now, people are like, oh, hey, well, how competent are we? Well, let's show them we're competent by holding them accountable. Our forebears didn't do us any favors. Beyond that, though, we do have to experiment. We have to realize that we're going to have to take a lot of risks. We're going to have to realize that we're not going to get everything right. And we have to be honest with ourselves. It's okay to be upset, and it's okay to be a little jaded, and it's okay not to know. That's actually really what I want to put down. It's okay that we don't have all the answers. What we need to realize is that we're working for something better than ourselves. And that is going to have to be the mission, is that we can't fail.